Hello and welcome back to another episode of the podcast Wild Wise at Whole. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for being here. And today I have a really nice episode that I know is going to resonate with a lot of you. We're going to discuss like people pleasing, boundaries, and how nervous system work will help you say no. I'm going to be talking about the fawn response in this episode and how that impacts relationships, how that leads to people pleasing, and how that pattern in your nervous system will keep you stuck. It's really interesting because one of the women in this cohort of R&R asked me if we would be doing boundary work, and whilst we covered it a little bit in R&R, I just had to say to her, like, that's deep, like, nervous system work that you need to do, because I think people don't realize how much like the patterns in our nervous system play out in our behaviors and our thought processes and the things that we do essentially to like keep ourselves safe, right? So boundaries is a massive one that is linked to somatic nervous system work. And then I also want to talk a little bit about like how this somatic awareness can help you set healthier boundaries whilst reducing like the guilt and the fear that you might feel around that. And maybe you might not have an awareness that you even feel fear around that, or it feels unsafe for you to do that. But I think when we're speaking about the language of the body, I always say to people, like, if something feels like a threat for the nervous system, essentially it feels unsafe for you to do that. So yes, we're going to be going into that. I hope this is a good, juicy episode for you and you take like a different perspective from maybe one that you've had before around setting boundaries and maybe why you people please. Okay, so when you think about people please and when you think about boundaries, it's like, have you ever said yes when you really wanted to say no? I know for me, massive. I actually didn't realize how much I struggled to set boundaries until I started doing like the trauma somatic work, nervous system work last year. And I was like, oh my God, it actually feels so unsafe for me to set boundaries. So it's interesting, right? Like, we say yes when we want to say no. Found yourself over explaining why you can't do something? And if so, you're definitely not alone. I work with many women and have many conversations around this stuff. And, like I've just said in the little opening, often this is a result of our nervous system and the response that we have created and designed to really keep us safe. So, people pleasing isn't a personality flaw. Setting boundaries or struggling to set boundaries isn't also a personality flaw. It's a survival response and it's something that is deeply wired into your nervous system. So, the purpose of this episode is to explore that connection between the fawn and the people pleasing, why it's so hard to set boundaries when your nervous system feels unsafe, and how through somatic work you can like break free from this pattern. So, the fawn response is something that is a little bit lesser known, it's not as commonly spoke about. I think in like, trauma spaces, and if you do trauma work, it will be. But I think the most common ones that we hear about are fight, flight, and freeze. So fawn is also a big one. I think fawn is really, really common amongst women. I think there's like a societal conditioning that naturally puts women in a fawn response. And I think that's because when we think about being in our sympathetic, like our fight and flight, our anger is something that also society conditions us and teaches us both really like obviously but also very subtly. It teaches us that it's not okay for women to be angry, and that women's expression of anger makes us crazy, it makes us hostile, it makes us chaotic, we're overly emotional. So there's all of like these attachments around us being in our fight or flight and using our sympathetic energy to mobilize and advocate for ourselves. So I think naturally when we think about responses, fawn for sure feels like one that I see a lot of women in. And they don't even realize it's a survival response. They don't even realize it's like a conditioning that's come from the nervous system to maintain a sense of safety and avoid conflict. So fawning is essentially the instinct to appease or please others to maintain a sense of safety and avoid conflict. So an example is saying yes to avoid disappointing someone or over apologizing to prevent tension. It can also be feeling responsible for other people's needs, feeling responsible for other people's reactions. And I think this is also one that can happen, like, you know, when we think about people being brought up in like really um like loving, you know, with like really loving parents and people who had like really great childhoods. I use this example because this is one that will often come up in therapy if I'm working with a woman and start to notice that she's in the fawn, because I think there's a misconception that when we say like safety and when we say survival response, that like that means threat. And that can be a little bit jarring for people because, you know, if you've got an amazing relationship with your parents, if you know that your parents done the best growing up, you know there wasn't any like what you might define as quote unquote childhood trauma, to start to put these pieces in place can feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I just want to say like it's really important to also just name that you can be in a fawn response just through, you know, like growing up being really aware that you don't want to upset your parents and that you don't want to rock the apple cart, or, you know, just situations like that where you were really like aware of like siblings' needs or mum and dad's needs. And I think there's some things like when I know for sure when I grew up, there was things that were said and things that were done that were just the norm back then. And now, obviously, like when we put those pieces together, we're like, oh, right, okay. Or, you know, like I'll give you something to cry about, or just like little things like that. I can't think off the top of my head, but like situations like that where it's not necessarily quote unquote, you know, a trauma or a dysfunctional dynamic that you grew up in growing up, or you just became really aware that you didn't want to disappoint someone. Maybe that was an experience at school that you had, maybe it was an experience with a teacher or a friend growing up. So it doesn't just come obviously from parents, but it is something that we build and it is something that forms in like our early experiences. And you know, a lot of the time it can also be linked to like a sense of low self-worth. So if you have a sense of low self-worth, you might always over apologize, you might always feel like you need to over explain yourself, you might always feel like you have to justify why you're taking up space. And these are just all things that can form in our early experiences that might not necessarily be quote unquote trauma or might not necessarily be quote unquote dysfunctional. So I just want to highlight that because I think when we use this language, sometimes it can make people just instantly switch off. But actually, if you just cast the net a little bit wider and kind of look at the nuances of how we develop this fawn response, you know, it can really help you start to understand what's going on for you and like maybe where some of these like safety mechanisms and responses came in the nervous system. So fawn can also come obviously from growing up in environments where love or safety felt conditional. And we can wire this response into the nervous system. So, you know, feeling like you only got love if you were behaving. So again, when I've just said before about like those just like old school parenting techniques, it's like, you know, if you were upset about something and it was like go to your room, like I don't want to deal with you, that can create this like ingrained pattern that okay, I only receive love and I'm only accepted if I'm the good girl or if I'm happy. So when I feel all of these other emotions, I don't receive connection, I don't receive love. And obviously that's not done with the intention of causing like unsafety to, you know, like a child, obviously, is it? But I just think it's really interesting when we start to look at like these old school kind of parenting techniques, you know, how teachers would be, things that were said, and then we start to link it, like I've said, to this. So that's the piece with fawn, right? Is like love or safety feels conditional, and this wires that response into the nervous system of people pleasing, to maintain a sense of safety or avoid conflict. So fawning becomes the default when the nervous system perceives that boundaries might be pushed back against or result in rejection, anger, disconnection. So before we even get to the point of being able to set boundaries, if we are in a space of people pleasing or fawning, like, boundaries in our body may result in rejection, anger, or disconnection. So that's like really unsafe, right? So before, this is what I say to people now that I do a lot of somatic work, is like, before we even get to the point of you trying to set the boundaries, like, we need to work with this part of self who has developed this safety mechanism in people pleasing, because we need to let her know that it's safe to start to set these boundaries. That's the work that I done as well last year personally, was like bringing all these parts of self in and working with like little Lydia a lot, to, as like the woman, as I connected more to like my body and like becoming the woman in my life, I would work with little Lydia to help her see that it's okay to have boundaries and it's safe to set boundaries. So instead of going out into the world and trying to set all of these boundaries, which can be quite triggering and quite dysregulating for the nervous system, it's like really understanding, like taking it a step back and really understanding, okay, why is it even difficult for you to set boundaries, and what does that mean when you think about setting a boundary? Like, what does that bring up in the body? What part of self is activated? What's the story around that? What's the state when you think about setting boundaries? So it's really important to look at this from like a dual perspective when you think about wanting to find it easier to set boundaries. Okay, so the nervous system impact of chronic people pleasing is constant hypervigilance. Constant hypervigilance. So when we think about how this starts to affect your body and your nervous system, so monitoring other people's needs, moods, and expectations. So again, you know, I work with a lot of clients who are just really like hyper aware and sensitive to what other people are going to be feeling. Really thinking about that right time that they can bring something up, really thinking about like if they want to have a conversation, when they should do that, because they're more kind of prone to managing somebody else's needs than if feeling like something that you want to discuss when you want to discuss that, right? Managing other people's expectations and being hyper vigilant to that. So if you don't want to do something, thinking, well, what are they going to think of me? And really internalizing that, like really internalizing that in a deep way of like, that's going to mean something about me, and that's going to mean something about like my inherent worth and value as a person if I say that I don't want to do something and let that person down. And also that the other kind of piece for the nervous system is when we think about capacity and we think about load, you know, we increase that mental load because we hold other people's like moods, emotions, responses, expectations, needs before our own, and that's a lot, right? So that can lead to like emotional burnout, and it can lead to emotional burnout in your nervous system from overgiving and neglecting yourself, from also constantly having this like hypervigilance and monitoring of the other people around you and what it is that they need. Feeling disconnected from your own desires because your focus is external. So again, a lot of people pleasing work that I do with women in sessions, it's like when I ask them what they need, they don't know, because they're that disconnected from it, because their focus has shifted from what they need to what others need, and that becomes the drive and focus point, and that actually becomes like the mover for how they live their lives. So a lot of the time, again, this can be quite jarring when you start to do this work, because it can make you realize that you actually don't live your life for you a lot of the time, depends on how strongly you people please, but your nervous system has become wired to disconnect from your own desires and needs and put your focus on the desires and needs of other people. And that can be as small as, you know, like, what do you want for dinner? I don't know. What do you want to do on the weekend? I don't know. Do you want to decorate the house this way? I'm not sure, whatever you want to do. Constantly saying all the time, well, what do you want to do? What feels good for you? And there's that fine balance, isn't there, between if you're in a relationship or a dynamic with somebody, to obviously you want both parties to have like space in the conversation and the decision making, but I know for a lot of women it's like, well, I don't know, whatever you want to do, and that will go across the board. from like deep desires, you know, emotional kind of problems, emotional communication, like sexual intimacy, like that will go for like show up in the big things, but it will also show up in the smallest of things as well. So it's just also reflecting on that spectrum in terms of how this is showing up in your life and showing up in your behaviours. So the internal conflict is like your mind will know that you should say no, but your body will feel unsafe doing that. So you'll feel like that internal push-pull. You feel that resistance. You know, you'll feel like you want to say no, or you'll sense in the mind, like, I actually don't really want to do that. And that might cause you to ruminate a lot on that. That might cause you to overthink. That might cause you to feel a sense of dread, a sense of exhaustion. So your body will be bringing up these cues that you don't want to do it, but it feels really difficult to say no or to set that boundary, because there's that unsafety. So it's almost like you're pushing up against an invisible, like, somatic wall in your body. And this is because, like I've said, your nervous system is wired to prioritize relationship safety over personal boundaries. So again, this is a big one as well when we think about like abusive relationships and we think about unhealthy dynamics. A lot of the time the fawn response will be something, especially if it's like emotional abuse. There's a lot of gaslighting, there's a lot of manipulation, there's a lot of like skewed perspectives. It's usually near on impossible if you're in an abusive relationship or with someone that's quite toxic and unhealthy to even have boundaries. But when you do try to set those, the consequences of that will be more prominent, and it will be pushed up against more, and then that's where techniques like gaslighting and stuff will come in, which can make this even more complex, you know, if that is something that you've experienced. And that's the other reason why then when we fawn, I think especially just in day-to-day life, but if you bring in this element of, you know, abusive relationships, you start to fawn because what your nervous system wants is safety and stability. And the way that you get that in an unhealthy dynamic is through self-sacrificing and putting the needs of the other person. It brings all of that stuff in, right, about the hypervigilance, and just like really wanting to anchor and hook into something that feels safe for you, even if that means that you self-abandon, because that will always be the driver for the nervous system. Anything that feels unsafe, that will always be the most prominent thing that it will work towards, is creating or anchoring into something that feels safe, even if that safe thing for you is detrimental. That's what it's going to be more geared towards until you start to do this work to repattern that, right? So then if we think about that just in general, relationships, taking out off the abusive lens for the moment, that you're still going to prioritize like safety over personal boundaries. So maybe friendships, or doing things with friends, or doing things with parents, or people pleasing with parents, siblings, colleagues. Like, you're always going to do that if that feels more safe than trying to set a boundary. So I think this is really good because it allows you to start to tap into like that self-compassion piece as well, and understand like why you're doing what you're doing. And again, remembering like it's not a personality flaw. So common signs that you're in your fawn is over explaining, or really feeling like you have to justify your no. Leaky, weak boundaries. So you'll try to set it, but you might skirt around it instead of just saying, I don't want to do this. This doesn't actually feel fun for me. For example, I'm not going to come. Or actually, instead of saying to a partner, that's really disrespectful and I really don't appreciate that. This is how I feel as a result of that, and that's not something that I really want to accept. They're just examples, but instead of naming it quite black and white, you might skirt around it. So you'll kind of be trying to set a boundary, but you're not setting a boundary, and you're not clear in, you know, what that boundary is. You might feel anxious or guilty after asserting yourself. So if you do kind of set a boundary, or if you do say something, or you say what you want to say, you then feel like super anxious or really guilty about it. You then overthink it, you ruminate it, that makes you worry about what people are going to think of you. You wondered if friends are not talking to you. You wondered if you've done something wrong. You wondered if you're the problem. And it really like spirals after you've like you've asserted yourself and set your boundary. And then also like another common sign is like agreeing to things that you don't want to do and then feeling resentful or depleted. So again, this is another thing. So like there's no kind of like easier option, right? Because when you do things as a people pleaser, or you struggle to set those boundaries, and someone is pushing up against that, or someone is completely railroading your boundaries, or you're doing things and you're agreeing to do things that you don't actually really want to do, that builds up resentment, especially in a relationship. And it means that, again, when we link it back to that emotional exhaustion, you end up emotionally burnt out because you're doing a lot of things that you don't actually want to do. And then also like the emotion that brings as a result of that is that's a lot to sit with and that's a lot to be with. And it's hard, isn't it, if you're in a relationship and you're agreeing to do things that you don't want to do, as simple as like a day out, and your partner's really happy, but let's say you feel like pissed that you don't want to do it and you're tired and it's just you're in a bit of a low mood. It then creates that really strange dynamic where it's like, well, why are you in a mood? Like you said you would come, and it just creates like this complexity and this like dynamic where nothing's really clear, because the main thing that you really wanted to do in that moment was to say, I actually don't want to go. Like that doesn't feel good for me. So this is like, these are signs that you can be in your fawn response. So how does nervous system work support healthy boundaries? I think one of the things just to also name is, like I said before, the spectrum. There's also a spectrum with how strong this is. So if fawn is a response of something like a trauma response that you've experienced, obviously there's going to be like the like trauma work that would come in to help you kind of break free from that fawn response. But let's just say we're looking at this from the perspective of talking about it. So it's relatable for everybody, right? So healing the fawn response really does start with creating safety within your nervous system, so that saying no longer feels like a threat. So like I said before we step out into the world and start to set these boundaries, as great as it is, all the books out there, all of the content out there about setting boundaries, if it does not feel safe in your body and if it feels like a threat, it is going to be really hard for you to do that, and it's going to be really, really hard for you to implement that long term if in your body and your nervous system it still feels like a threat. Okay, so when we think about building internal safety, if we just step back from the outward expression of that in terms of boundaries and we just think about like that internal work with ourselves, I would always say, hands down, getting support off a practitioner for sure, because when you're working with your body and when you're working with these like ingrained responses, at first it is a blind spot and it's hard for you to break the cycle when you're in the cycle and the cycle feels safe. Okay, so I'll say that again. It's hard for you to break the cycle when you're in the cycle and the cycle feels safe. It's like, how do you make something go from feeling unsafe to safe when you're experiencing that in your body, right? So I would always say receive support from someone who can hold you and help you with that, who understands nervous system, who understands kind of like the somatic piece and the somatic element. Breath work is a big one. So a technique that you can use after you try to say no, or you do say no when you say it yourself, is start to calm your nervous system when you feel any guilt or fear after saying no, or if you feel like any anxiety. So you can do something called coherent breathing. Coherent breathing is really simple, and all you essentially do is equal inhale and exhale in and out through the nose, or if it feels good for you, you can exhale out the mouth. Try to make this for a count of 5 or 6. The slower that you breathe, the better for the ventral nervous system, which is the parasympathetic part of your nervous system, which is your rest and digest, which is what you come into when there's an element of safety in the body. So when you breathe slow and you breathe deep, that's going to start to send cues to the body and the nervous system that you're in a space of safety, or there's less perceived threat. Okay, so this will start to reduce those stress cortisol levels. It will also start to reduce kind of the intensity of the emotion. You also don't have to close your eyes to do this. So another thing that you can do is, as you do coherent breathing, you can look around your environment. You can do this if you're on a walk. You can kind of orient around your environment, really slow down the movements of your eyes and take things in around you in the room. That is going to be really, really soothing and stabilizing for your nervous system. So when you feel kind of those emotions arise, when you feel the guilt, the fear, the anxiety, come into a couple of minutes of coherent breathing. Close your eyes with it if you want to. So again, just to repeat that so you know, coherent breathing is equal inhale and exhale. Slow the breath down, breathe deeply into the body for the count of 5 or 6. If you exhale out the mouth, ensure that the jaw is nice and soft. You can bring in some really nice sighs if you want to. And yeah, that is coherent breathing. Really simple, really effective, okay? That is going to settle you and ground you into the body a little bit more. And that is also going to start to bring in a sense of safety after a threat has been activated in relation to saying no, in relation to, the people pleasing and all of that stuff that we've discussed. The other thing that you can do is bring in body awareness in. Okay, so tuning into physical cues that your nervous system is being activated. So, tight chest, racing heart, thoughts racing in your mind, change in temperature, maybe you feel clammy, feeling like you are on the go all the time, it's hard to rest, picking your phone up all the time, noticing that hypervigilance, noticing certain thought patterns that come, I wonder what she's thinking about me, have I done something wrong? So all of these cues, these physical cues, these like psychosomatic cues are great for you to start to notice when you are activated in your nervous system and there's a threat that is present. Also start to notice on a body-based level how it feels. So again, when I do work with clients, before we even get into like all of the things to start to change it, the first thing I say to clients is awareness. You need that awareness because you need to be able to feel what is happening in your body when you are doing the things that you don't want to be doing, or when there's a threat present. You need to understand your body, because it's like, imagine you're in a relationship with someone and you don't really know them and something's going on and you want to help them. You don't know anything about them. So how do you know how to help them? How do you know what you need to do? How do you know what's going to be supportive? You don't. So in any relationship in your life with a physical person, if you were going to help them, you would want to know about them, right? To be able to give them the support that they need. Even if it's like a client in work, for example, I need to have an understanding of their experience and who they are as people to really to be able to start to help them properly in a way that like really, really meets where they're at. So the same applies to your body. Think about that as a relationship. You need to understand the physical cues, you need to understand the sensations, you need to understand how guilt feels when it's in your body versus fear. What's the somatic difference of that? How does that feel in your nervous system? How does that feel in your body? What does that make you want to do? How old does that make you feel? What part of self does that bring online? Does that feel like a teenage self? Does that feel like an inner child self? Does that bring up any memories when you just allow your mind to wander, when you're tuned into the guilt and the fear, okay? So the other thing I would say with the body awareness is like, don't overly sit in the emotion, but just get used to like dropping in. So it's called titration. You just bring little droplets of the sensation that you feel, and then you come out of it and you focus on something that feels more pleasant for the body and the nervous system. That's also something you can literally learn to do. It's probably going to be harder if you're doing it at home. But that is something that you could do if you want to start to become more somatically aware of what you're feeling. You would just sit with the anxiety for a moment, and then you might have the ability to be able to come out of it and focus on something else, okay? And then I think also like grounding exercises, if we're going to keep techniques like really simple, because when you think about a certain boundaries, being able to be grounded and soothed in your body is really important. So grounding exercises, some of those I can think off the top of my head. Allow yourself to stand up, place your heels on the floor, or place your feet on the floor. Bring yourself up onto your tiptoes, and as you exhale, bang your heels on the floor, and that's really going to ground you into the floor. Okay, that's a really nice one that you can do a couple of times. Another really nice grounding exercise that you can do is squeezing the forearms. Really nice somatic practice that's yeah, really soothing. And you can squeeze up the arms, kind of bring some pressure to the shoulders, down the arms, and all you're simply doing is just squeezing each side of the body, squeezing up and down the arms. That's really nice as well, playing around with different like pressures, different sensations, but that's really good to kind of bring you into your body as well. And another really nice one that you can do is somatically play around with exploring boundaries. This is one of the techniques that I put in the R&R somatic library actually, because I just think it's a really good one. You can visualize in your mind like setting a boundary, and as you visualize that, you can almost like edit that memory, and you can imagine yourself setting the boundary before you do it, right? And then as you visualize, notice what comes up in your body. So start to build this mind body connection when you think about setting your boundaries. And one of the other things, if you want to take that a step further, that you can do is start to play around with exploring somatically, like creating your space that's your boundary. So the way that I do that in with clients and explain it is, so like let's say you're in a meditation, or you've just come out of a breath work, or let's say you really want to start to set boundaries, right? You like take a couple of minutes to breathe into the body, connect to the body, notice what you feel, right? And then just start to like play around with the space. So like straighten your arms out in front of you and start to move your arms around you as if you're creating this bubble, right? And imagine this bubble is like a certain colour, and then really slow it down and imagine like you're creating this energetic boundary before you even step out into the world and create a boundary. And start to notice as you breathe and move, how does it feel to set that boundary? How does it feel to create that spaciousness? That's your space. Okay, that's your space where you can assert yourself, where you can be boundaried, where you can meet your own needs. And just, even if you have to do that, like for a couple of weeks before you even think about setting boundaries, like that's okay, because what you're gifting the body is an experience to somatically explore the topic of boundaries and create safety in your nervous system without it being a real-time experience that feels like a threat and triggers a threat response in your body. Okay, so as you do that, you might notice anxiety, you might notice contraction, you might notice spaces where it feels really easy to kind of move that boundary out. And then you can play around with visualizing somebody standing in front of you. And as you visualize that person standing in front of you, like notice what you feel in your body. And again, start to play around with exploring and setting that energetic boundary. Notice what you feel in your body. Notice as you bring your hands in front of that person, how does that feel? Does it cause contraction? Do you feel guilt? Do you feel anxiety? And that's a really, really amazing, that when I do that with clients in sessions, within the first minute, it will tell me so much about how they feel about boundaries. It's a fucking phenomenal, easy, but like jarring exercise that you can do. I love that one. It always leaves people like, oh my God, this is so uncomfortable. Yeah, so now you're putting your body in a situation where it can start to explore that, and you can really, really feel like the imprint of that in the body. And also in terms of like that visual exercise, like linking mind and body, you can also practice like vocalizing your no. So find your no, but also find your yes. That's also really important when we think about playing around with these things in our nervous system and how to start to break free from these patterns, right? Like find your yes. So like do some mirror work, look at yourself in the mirror, say yes, breathe, connect in. Okay, what do you notice? Bring a scenario to mind where you want to say yeah. and bring that visual element, bring imagination into it, because the body also doesn't know if you're imagining it or it's happening in real time. Okay, so like bring a visualization in where you can start to say yes, where you can say no, find your voice. Notice, does it even feel uncomfortable? Again, this is a big one I see with clients. It feels it gets stuck in the throat for women. The energy literally gets locked in the throat, and they're like, I physically cannot get the words out. And I'm like, okay, good that you notice that, because that's happening repeatedly, but you're just not aware enough to notice that. So all of these things are really amazing somatic practices that you can start to do to break this cycle in your nervous system. Find your yes, find your no, explore your needs, explore your boundaries, explore standing, being assertive for yourself. Like, even play around with your posture, right? So like, stand in the mirror, notice your posture, like when you feel, bring a scenario to mind where you think about setting a boundary or like putting your own needs first. Let your body kind of like feel that and fall into that, and then open your eyes and notice what you notice. How do you hold yourself? What's your posture like? And then think about like doing that, you know, like think if you were to move that, and if you were to feel more like assertive, and you were to feel more like safe in setting your boundaries, what would shift and change? Like, would your shoulders come back? Would your head come up? You know, like, would your arms soften by your side? Would your knees soften, your body become a little bit more soft and not as rigid? And then again, you breathe into that and you open your eyes and you just notice what you notice. So there's so many like amazing ways we can start to rewire this like pattern in our nervous system, and also start to become really attuned with what it is that we're feeling, because it's also really important to remember that it's it's not about getting rid of how you're feeling. It's about learning to hold the duality and be with both or all elements of you, right? Like the guilt, the anger, the fear, the self-abandoning, that's not wrong, and we don't want to name it as wrong, so we don't want to be judgmental against it. We want to build compassionate awareness for that part of us who feels that way, and be able to just tune into also where it is that we want, who we want to become, and the woman that we want to become. Okay, and then just some other like practical tips for setting boundaries and to help with people pleasing without guilt is like reframe boundaries as like an act of self-love, right? So it's not a rejection to somebody else, it's an act of self-respect. And that was a big one for me last year, is I was so kind of programmed to put other people's needs before my own, because, well, it felt unsafe to not do that. So when I started to set boundaries, you know, there was a part of me that felt so responsible um for other people's emotions and needs, and I had to keep telling little Lydia that it's an act of self-respect. So I'm not rejecting those who I can no longer hold, but actually what I'm giving myself is self-respect. What I'm giving myself is um love. What I'm doing is advocating for myself to help me get out of this cycle that I am in, and that's really, really important. So reframing it as self-love. Write that down if you need to. A boundary is not a rejection of someone else, it's an act of self-love. Okay, start with really simple steps. I say this to clients all the time. Start with low stakes situations. So I was talking to a client about this yesterday on a call. You know, this is a client who's been in chronic disassociation for like a decade now, um who's also a chronic people pleaser. Imagine I would come on a call with her and be like, okay, let's just step out, like, you can do it, like, I know you can do it, like, go out and do it, like, set your boundaries, like, and I come on really hot and heavy, like, that's fucking stupid. So what I actually said to her was, what you need to start with is small things, right? So before you even take out saying anything to anyone else at the moment, I said to her, like, wake up every morning, and when you don't know what your needs are because you're so used to people pleasing, start by finding out that question. What do I need? I said, and make that as simple as, I used an example of I have different cups for coffee. I have a cup that's like a really big mug. It's like a good cacao cup, but sometimes I'll have like a big cup of coffee in the morning, and sometimes I have like a smaller cup of coffee. Depends on what cup I use. Use changes my cup of coffee in the morning, right? And I said to her, like, stay with me on this because um it's following back to what I'm saying. Of a morning when I wake up, before I make my cup of coffee, I will think, what cup do I want to use today? Do I want a smaller, almost like flat white, or do I want like a big old cup of coffee? How am I feeling? What cup do I want to use? What type of coffee do I want to use? I said, that's me checking in of a morning. What do I need? And then from that, as simple as a cup of coffee, I can then give myself the coffee that I need and I want, and I can enjoy that cup of coffee, right? So I said to her, check in with the smallest of things. What do I want for lunch? What do I want for dinner? What is it that I feel like eating? And start with that, because when you start to notice what you need and you meet your own needs, that is also fundamental part of the process when it comes to people pleasing and breaking that pattern and coming out of that fawn response, because you start to advocate for yourself with yourself, you start to meet your own needs, you start to show up for yourself, and naturally that one small step is going to ripple out into getting you to the point where you can do that with other people and you don't feel the guilt, the shame, the fear, right? Another way that you could do it is start with like really low stakes situations almost. So decline an invitation, or if your partner says, do you want this for dinner, or your friend goes, do you want to go here for dinner, just like take a moment before you automatically answer to feel into what you notice. And I even say to people, like, when you have people around you who you can be authentic with, who can help you in this process, fucking name what you're doing. Say, like, I know this sounds ridiculous, like, I'm really struggling, but I'm gonna name it because, like, this is the reason why, this is something that I really need to work on. I'm feeling anxiety right now, but like I just really need to say that I actually don't fancy going to Nando's. I'd love to go for a Chinese. And just name it and bring a lightness into this process, right? Bring some humour, bring support, just bring lightness into it. Like if your partner says, oh, do you want to do this? You can say like, oh, I know, like I feel so stupid saying this, but like I don't want to do that, and I'm just naming what's happening for me right now because I know it's going to help me say what I need to say. And just this is also going to help with people who feel safe for you and people who feel like supportive advocates in your healing journey. This is going to create, like, take away shame. This is going to bring like laughter into the process. This is going to bring some like, banter into the process. Your friend might say to you like, I don't know, fucking hell, how dramatic, of course we can go for Chinese, but that is just going to lighten this process for you. So don't also be afraid to name and bring people into this process, and start with these smaller situations, because people around you are so important. We make change through, yes, our own healing, our own nervous system and being there for ourselves, but also co-regulation and co-support is so important for our nervous system. Finding safety and other people mirroring safety for us in things that feel unsafe is so important. But those people can't do that if they don't understand what you're experiencing, right? So that's another thing I would say, a really practical step. Use like short, clear responses. I can't do that right now, or that doesn't really work for me, but are you free on another date? And if it feels a little bit much for you to just say bluntly in a short, clear response, that doesn't work for me, but it's someone again who you feel safe with, who you feel will understand like the process that you're in, that doesn't work for me right now, but are you free any other day? Or if it's someone who you don't want to offer that to, just like, that doesn't work for me right now. And you just name it as that, okay? So just keep it short, keep it clear. And also know that you don't have to instantly respond if someone comes back to that. So again, allowing the pause, allowing the space, allowing you to notice what you notice, and then you step back into a response if you feel you need to or you want to, okay? Which brings me to my second one. Practice before answering, so you don't say yes automatically. Practice pausing, before you answer. So you're not in that automatic loop. Awareness, pausing, slowing it down is massive to help you start to break that loop, what's going on in the body, okay? Normalize the discomfort, like I've just said then, like bring it into space with friends, normalize it with yourself, like, okay, this feels really unsafe for me, this is a bit shit for me, I feel uncomfortable because I'm adjusting to a new pattern of safety. Name that, right? Like, don't avoid that. Don't kind of think that you shouldn't be feeling this stuff, because it's all of the duality. This is what you feel when you break these deep rooted patterns in your nervous system and you start to put yourself first. Because over time, when you stick to this, I always say consistency, compound effect, the slowness, the dripping when it comes to your nervous system of these behaviours that you are doing. One day, I promise you, you wake up and you're like, oh shit, I just declined doing something and actually it didn't feel unsafe, or I've not spiraled, because your body learns that it's not dangerous to say no, it's empowering, okay? But like, think about the time that you've spent in this like people pleasing and this fawn response, right? You can't expect to do 12 weeks or fucking, I don't know, 6 months of work and then go, well, I expected I'd be able to set boundaries like with utter ease. It's like, okay, well, it might take 12 weeks, it might take 6 months, it might take a year, depends. However long your body takes, right? But it's like, we can't just expect to wake up after a week and be like, oh, it's still feeling like super uncomfortable. Like, why is that? Well, of course, it's still feeling uncomfortable because these are patterns that are so automatic and ingrained around safety in your nervous system. It takes time to repattern safety, but it's absolutely possible. You know, Deb Dana, when she speaks about polyvagal theory, says it takes on average 66 days to start to create new patterns of safety in the nervous system when you follow the lens of polyvagal theory. This is one of the reasons why R&R is 14 weeks, because it surpasses that 66 days and it allows women to receive support for the 14 weeks to really start to get into the flow of breaking these ingrained nervous system patterns, okay? So there are some things that I hope you found beneficial. And if you do ever feel like you want to do the work on your nervous system to break these patterns, then my R&R Restore and Reconnect will probably be starting again in about 8 weeks time. I think it'll be starting the beginning of May. So it is in that program that we focus on creating internal safety needed to break free from people pleasing. And you know, all of the kind of the practices, the tools, the techniques, the support that you need to really start to notice what's happening in your nervous system and start to break cycles and patterns of unsafety. So yeah, so this leads to greater self-trust, confidence, more authentic relationships where you feel seen and respected, the ability to honour your own needs without sacrificing connection. So although we don't start for about 8 to 10 weeks, I am just dropping it in and talking about it because, you know, for some of you it might feel like a good thing, and then it gives you space to like plan, have a conversation with me if you want to, kind of get your eggs in a row, as they say, in case this does feel like a good supportive next step for you. So yes, I hope you've enjoyed that episode. I want you to remember that your worth is not defined by how much you do for others. So, you know, every time you set a boundary, every time you put yourself first, it's an act of self-respect, and you are teaching your nervous system that it's safe to choose yourself. You are choosing it new and you are breaking the cycle, okay? And a journal prompt that you can take away is, where in my life am I saying yes when I really want to say no? What would it feel like to honour my true needs in that situation? And if the answer for that question comes up, I don't know what I need, I'm going to invite you to start to know what you need. Ask yourself that question. What do you need and what do you desire? Okay? Share this episode with anybody who struggles with people pleasing, struggles to set boundaries. I'm sure we all know women in our lives who struggle with that. And yes, that is it from me. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I've loved recording it for you. It's been great, and I shall see you on the other side. Bye.